Hey everyone, Kaya here with Revolutionary Being, and you're back on my channel, my new YouTube channel where I get to talk about kind of all the greater and grander ideas that come through in terms of how we can traverse the territory we're in now as awakened humans, and kind of all the ins and outs of that and what that looks like. So today I wanted to talk about mob mentality and collective ancestral trauma templates. And first I'm going to go through a little bit of a sort of metaphysical overview of what these templates kind of look like. So maybe we can start to get a visual of kind of how our interface looks with the greater mind or the greater field through these templates, and how they manifest both with our individual templates and how that kind of interfaces with the greater templates. And maybe you guys can share with me what comes through for you in terms of what your experiences have been in how you experience the subtle realms or your greater field through kind of your subtle energetic anatomy. So if we start with our personal energetic anatomy, then we can see where we sort of carry certain energetic codes or templates. And like I've discussed in other videos, they show up sort of differently through different energy centers. And so we have sort of almost like plug-in points to this greater field and the different levels of this greater field through these light codes. They're like light codes. So these light codes create a sort of pattern, and it's a pattern that's always in flux, right? So, and this is where you get the sacred geometry stuff. So the field itself has a light grid, and there are different dimensions and layers within the field that have different kinds of light grids that give expression to different kinds of patterns, which is that sacred geometry. And so we plug in to the different aspects of this field through our different energy centers, right? Because we are in and of ourselves like a form of sacred geometry or a system of light codes at the subtle levels. And so we're in sort of like a subtle entrainment with aspects of this greater field. And one of those aspects is these trauma templates. So at the level of source, where you're just in the source field, that's just pure energy. But once you get into these other levels and layers, you get into more structured templates. And one of those templates can be like trauma templates. And so you could think of these templates how you would think of like a morphogenetic field. And in the same way I've been talking about greater templates and sort of how like a bodhisattva would break through a threshold and create new pathways. And then that gets infused into a certain template in the greater mind. Well, we also have those on the level of trauma, and especially like collective ancestral type traumas, like the types of experiences and traumas that get passed down through many generations, but not just transgenerational trauma. I'm not really talking about that, or traumas that are necessarily passed down through bloodlines. Talking more about collective trauma overall. So how historical experiences get repeated through different epochs and cycles. And, there's different ones within different epochs too. But so we have sort of a subtle entrainment to these greater patterns through the light codes. And that happens from within. And oftentimes the individual is actually born into certain templates that they are tasked with unlocking. And so when you unlock an individual template, an individual trauma template, you can actually begin to influence the collective through the collective mind as well by creating those new pathways. So you can think of the pathways as like, if you were looking at a brain, like an active brain, it would have all these neuronal signals that create networks that over time, when they're habituated, they're reinforced into pre-existing networks. So the same thing exists in the greater field and mind. There are pre-existing networks, but when the human becomes individuated, and we'll talk more about this, when we get to this next level of evolution and consciousness, we actually have the power to co-create through being connected with source consciousness. We actually have the power to use our creative power individually to create new pathways. So you can think of that in terms of like Christ consciousness was something like that happened. It's like, and I've talked about this before, it's like when someone gets through a certain threshold, those pathways, they forge new pathways, and those get infused into the collective mind. So anyway, going back, so we're handed these different personal templates, and it usually looks like trauma and conditioning and basically our evolutionary life wave. So I'm talking about the life wave of the soul, right? The evolutionary life wave of the soul and human consciousness is also an expression sort of the sacred geometry. When you look at it from that level, it's actually the interaction of light and different light codes, but you can see the relationship between the human's sort of sacred geometry and the field, and how that creates a trajectory through time space, through lifetimes, and it's parallel to the evolution of consciousness. So we're often born into these templates, and human consciousness can actually be trapped in pre-existing templates. So before you have the I am, before you've given birth to the I am, right? Before you've individuated or woken up to a certain degree and made that unconscious conscious, connected back into that source point, you have that I am awareness and consciousness. Now, before that, often most of us are walking around acting out pre-existing templates. So the pre-existing templates are driven by the unconscious mind. They're driven by unconscious impulses from the unconscious mind. And this is mainly through the astral body or the astral realms. And Rudolf Steiner, we'll touch on his work a little bit here, but I would recommend, if you want to know more about his work, to go look it up directly, because everything I express is going to be sort of filtered through my own understandings. And I'm not saying it's necessarily exactly what he meant, but this is what I get out of it. So the Luciferic, he calls them the Luciferic impulses at that level. So these impulses that come through the unconscious, they're feeling impulses, okay? They're like subjective feeling impulses, and they're connected through the unconscious mind to these astral realms and the astral body in these astral realms, and through the shadow, through the unconscious mind, shadow, astral realm aspect of that, they're connected to these astral entities. So we're talking sort of like the lower astral planes where repressed emotion and the shadow of humanity plays out. And there are these entities there that are Luciferic sort of. And anyway, so when you get into mob consciousness, okay, you're getting into that sort of unconscious impulse in the realms that come through that. Because within mob consciousness, the I am is not activated. Individual enlightened consciousness isn't activated, right? You're surrendering that to the nameless, faceless mob, the blameless mob, okay? But we'll get back to that later. So frenzied mobs are actually a really well-suited delivery mechanism for the sort of projection of the unconscious shadow impulses of the collective. And it's actually like a conjuring up of food. It's a food source for the entities that exist on that plane. I know it's kind of creepy, but there are lots of different kinds of beings, astral beings, and beings that just sort of interact with humans at different levels. So this is part of it. So these entities are often what we consider from our view malevolent, right? These are like the devils and the demons, and but they're actually a direct reflection of the shadow of humanity, or the shadow of your own shadow, of your repressed emotional energies. So while we're on Rudolf Steiner in the moment, basically he talks about, I think 2 or 3 impulses, but he talks about the luciferic impulses, which I just explained. And he also talks about the ahrimanic impulses. And so the ahrimanic impulses are a lot more relevant to where we're at today, because Ahriman and the ahrimanic impulses have to do with technology and the kinds of forces that ride through technology, or even like frequency. So the reason this is so important for us to start to understand is because technology, and even at just a frequency level, is being weaponized. And if we can understand our own energetic makeup and how it interacts with frequency and energy and vibration, and we're actually aware of that, then we know you can actually navigate which ones, you can manage that relationship. So we're in an acceleration right now of the ahrimanic impulses, and that has to do with technology, and it has to do with the sort of like possession of human consciousness by the forces that come through technology. So Rudolf Steiner talks about the mineral body. So we started with an astral body, right, when we were evolving. And here's the thing: these impulses they're there to help serve the evolution of human consciousness. So you can't really say, you wouldn't really necessarily be able to just do away with all this, even though it's evil on one level, or it's an impulse that can trap human consciousness or throw us off trajectory to some degree. It's there as a sort of initiatory force. So Rudolf Steiner talks about the mineral body, okay? And I'm not sure I'm interpreting this right, but when I interpret that through my recent meditations and realizations, what I see that as is sort of like the cellular molecular structure of the cell salts, as microscopic crystalline structures that actually transmit or are a conduit or attract different kinds of frequency. So he talks about how the ahrimanic impulses actually can move through, technology, or the energy of technology, and actually come into possession of our mineral body. And when that happens, it takes over our higher thoughts. So when someone's in a pre-existing template, right, and Ahriman's involved, then they don't really have their own thoughts. So the thoughts are actually birthed from, the other side or whatever, and given through these templates, right? So part of the individuation process and part of the I am process, right, is birthing our own thoughts. And within that, creating the new world, right? We become co-creators. So that's Ahriman. So the mineral body serves as almost like a conductor of existing templates if it's not consciously inhabited, I guess is what I'm saying. Okay, so during an apocalyptic type moment, like we're in now, where you have a culmination of trajectories or a point in our evolution where there's a culmination point, everything's accelerated, and the trajectories kind of split off at that point. You've got the death of the old world, and you have a birth of a new one, but you're sort of in between. So you're going to have one foot in each world almost, and you're going to have to like go through initiatory experiences to get that foot out of that old world and move forward. And actually, for now, like in the birthing of the new human consciousness, actually co-create this new world. So those two trajectories are pretty simple when you look at it from the perspective of Ahriman, and it's very clear when you look at what's taking place that this is actually happening, which is the difference between a materialistic pathway and a spiritual pathway. And I know people don't like the word spiritual because it's so loaded and there's so many different interpretations, and it's kind of like makes you seem like you're better than because you're spiritual and someone else isn't. That's not really what I'm talking about. So let me explain what I'm talking about. So the materialistic pathway is going to be a path where science and technology sort of drive consciousness, and lower existing templates drive consciousness. And within that, you have not only the trapping of human consciousness and evolution and the changing of that trajectory, but you also have actually literally using technology to try to physically live forever, or to try to mess with genetics, or control the birthing process, control physical evolution on Earth. So from Rudolf Steiner's perspective, from what I've been listening to recently, it locks the human template to Earth, right? Not to say Earth's bad. I love Earth, Gaia, but I think what he means is this old world, right? Because Earth actually goes through new incarnations and births as well. So what does the other path look like? The other path looks like developing your own inner organic technology. So we are going to have to learn how to manage our own energy systems, to understand how our subtle energy systems plug into the field, and how to manage and navigate that process through the I am pathway, right? And by becoming a conscious co-creator. So we're not trying to live forever physically. If you try to live forever physically, if you try to postpone your death like too much, you're actually avoiding the evolution of your consciousness, right? Because your consciousness evolves through a few different worlds, layers and levels. Like you can't just stay here physically alive and still evolve your consciousness. You would be avoiding your life path. So that's kind of like the extreme expression of where that's going. And I don't know how soon that is. I can see seeds of it now. So it might be 20 years, it might be 10 years, it might be 40 years, but there's already parts of that taking place. So I think we need to make a choice now. So within this, the sovereign individual, right, the I am, can be a channel for new pathways in this greater mind. If you think of it as these networks, right, these light codes and networks, the sovereign individual, especially now, it always could really, because that's what Christ did, and that's what the Bodhisattvas did, and that's what the Buddha did. But it's especially now, there's an acceleration of that, where there's the birth of the I am on a really grand scale. So individuals become more sovereign and become these co-creators. They can create new templates. And that's through developing that higher function, through channeling the source energy through your higher functions. These new templates are accessed. So part of how human spiritual evolution, or the evolution of human consciousness, happens is through trauma. And I know this is kind of tricky territory because we don't really want to condone the inflicting of trauma or absolve people from the responsibility of inflicting trauma. But trauma is our experiences here, and our traumas are sort of what shape our consciousness, or especially if we come into I am consciousness and we can actually integrate those fully into wholeness and not become fragmented. That's what it's the quickening or churning, alchemical process for our consciousness. And so one of the other ways that human consciousness evolves is through these collective initiations. And so the so-called like evil manifest on the planet and the shadow of humanity coming forth is part of that initiation. The having to navigate through and make a very clear choice between materialism and technology and going away from self and away from source, and your inner organic tech and choosing the I am and choosing source and dying, letting your physical body die. That's, oh shoot, I lost where I was. That's part of that initiation. So souls either progress or regress along these trajectories. And that's not to say that like, oh, you avoided a trauma for one lifetime, or you couldn't get past this one trauma. Oh, you're going to hell. It's not like that. And it's not like, oh, now you're put back to preschool or whatever. It's not quite that like simple. It's more complex than that. But if a human spends like many, many, many lifetimes choosing something other than their own evolution, then not as a punishment, but they're just automatic, they're going to regress. You're going to regress. So, I mean, that's just the reality of the situation. I think people are uncomfortable with that too, that and we can't always judge and say that because somebody's acting a certain thing out that they're regressing. That's hard for us to tell. It's hard for us to see the big picture of how people learn and evolve, how people's consciousness actually learns and evolves. But if you are choosing to self-avoid for too long, that generally is going to lead to the degradation of your consciousness. And so you'll regress. I don't know why I went off on that tangent. Anyway, so we've got this mob consciousness, right? And the mob consciousness comes from the shadow, or the unconscious collective shadow from these astral realms. And within that, you have this faceless, blameless individual, right? And so part of what's happening with mob consciousness or even groupthink is that the individuals are surrendering that I am. And one of the ways you can tell is that when mobs get really frenzied and when they commit these crimes and acts, they don't have any responsibility for it, right? So part of mob consciousness is like you're surrendering responsibility, and you can't really surrender responsibility without surrendering sovereignty. So human sovereignty and individuation and awakening and all that comes right alongside of personal responsibility. So even at a certain point, like all your traumas and everything, it's your responsibility to heal that and to integrate that. And you realize at a certain level, like, okay, yeah, I'm bigger than just this physical one lifetime. And I came in to these lessons and these metaphysical relationships with my field through the traumas and through the experiences for a reason, right? I was a match for all that somehow. So the other thing I wanted to talk about in terms of mobs is how we, the biological evolution. So how we evolved to be tribal as a survival mechanism. So if you believe that we evolved from kind of an animalistic body, which I know not everyone does, but if you do, then, and you can see it anyway, that humans have a survival brain and they have a survival nervous system. They have their parasympathetic or the sympathetic nervous system and the brain stem, right? That supposedly developed and evolved long before our frontal cortex that does like the higher thinking and all that. And so part of this individuation process in the current collective lessons is, and not falling into getting swept up into groupthink, right, or mob mentality, is the recognition of when your survival mechanisms are triggered. Because we all have these sort of wired in biological survival mechanisms, and you can even weave this through ancestral trauma. If you go far enough back, like our ancestors literally depended on each other in groups to survive. And so that's really deeply wired in. And even though then it was probably more physically centered, it's become more socially centered. It's become more morally centered, right? But I think it's moving through the same network. So it's basically something feels like a threat, right? So an idea can actually feel like a death threat to some people. They don't realize they're being driven by that. But when you start disagreeing with somebody, it can actually trigger, or they start disagreeing with you or telling you you're wrong, it can actually trigger that survival networking, right? So part of our work and part of understanding how not to get swept into this group consciousness and stay in charge of the I am is to recognize when your sympathetic nervous system is activated. And so when that sympathetic nervous system is activated, again, you've got chemicals, neurochemicals and everything that are released that override the higher thinking and that override your ability to understand that you're being driven by unconscious impulses. So when that gets activated and overrides your higher thinking and your higher processes in general, then again, you've got that unconscious shadow self taking over. Because the way that you make the unconscious mind awake, one of the main ways, is by getting into a deep state of relaxation so that you can actually traverse those realms. So you can't really traverse the unconscious mind or the astral realms or any of that consciously unless you're in a deep parasympathetic state. So if you're in the opposite of that, then those things, those impulses can drive you. Very easily, they can drive you. So that's part of what's happening with groupthink and mob consciousness. So it's a combination of these biological survival mechanisms and then how that makes the unconscious and these realms of entities the drivers. So, and again, that distinction between personal responsibility and being faceless and blameless behind a group, right? That is an evolutionary decision, a spiritual evolutionary decision, because you cannot be in your I am, like I said, if you don't take personal responsibility. So hopefully that's all kind of clear. Yeah, so I wanted to touch on just the concept of evil. Well, first of all, I'm actually going to make another video about sort of the practical aspects of how to unplug from certain templates and create new templates and upgrade your existing templates. And so right now I'm explaining it from kind of like a metaphysical level mostly. And I wanted to kind of do that as an overview because I think we're moving into a future in which that kind of understanding how to navigate that's going to be really important. But there are the really practical levels of how to deal with one's trauma, how to find one's causal points within the causal body, which is what creates and materializes the experiences that become the traumas, and what keeps attracting experiences that reflect to us our trauma points through the trigger points. So there's ways to deal with all that material practically, and I wrote up sort of an overview, but I didn't include it in here because this was getting too long. But I did, and I am also going to make another video about evil, the concept of evil and what it actually is. And I want to open up maybe a larger discussion about the different ways to interpret what evil is and our place in that, basically. But I wanted to touch on it a little bit here as an expression of the fragmented, unconscious aspects of the collective mind or the individual mind in a way that harms others or attempts to stunt the evolution of consciousness. And I want to speak to the fact that this evil exists as a part of a larger, multifaceted structure of these templates. So even the unconscious mind in its expression of evil has certain templates and memory, collective memory and certain entities. And that's where you get the luciferic and the Ahrimanic impulses. You have those archetypes and entities in there, but it's part of a larger mandala, right? So as that larger mandala, it almost has its own kind of, it doesn't really have its own will. It's not like it's sentient, but it's driven by us in a way. But there's so many moving parts and pieces. It is actually kind of like moving and evolving in its own right a little bit. I hope that makes sense. But I wanted to kind of paint a picture of that mandala again, just like all these different varying degrees of reality with these templates and these mandalas and the archetypes and the beings that exist there and how we plug in, and then our individual templates and how they, interlock with these. And it's all sort of light codes, right? Anyway, so hopefully, let me know if you have any questions about any of that. So I was actually mob bullied from a pretty young age. And it started in adolescence and it went almost through my teenage years. Well, at least the first part of my teenage years. And I was basically bullied by a somewhat largish group of girls. And that took the form of screaming and yelling at me, just calling me names, writing about me in the locker room, chasing me home from school. I got death threats. They were always threatening to beat me up. None of them ever did. I was a very awkward, I was a coward in a way. I was afraid to stand up for myself. If I had ever stood up for myself, perhaps they would have just shut up. I don't know. But there was a smaller group of like real bullies. And then there was all the rest of the school that just sort of went along with what they did because they were afraid of them too. So I was sort of singled out for quite a few years. And I was really afraid to go to school. I was crying like every day for a while. And I thought about it recently and I was thinking, what if I had like a really comfortable adolescence where everyone loved me? Maybe I would have got too comfortable and I never would have broke these templates and I would never would have figured this out. I never would have forged my own path and gone my own way because I would have been so comfortable in the group. I was never comfortable in the group. The group never accepted me ever, from my own family to this people at school. Like I had little pockets where groups accepted me, but by that time came, I was already so traumatized, and repressed that didn't change the imprinting, at least not right off the bat. So, maybe it was a blessing in disguise, but I got this experience really young. And so at a certain point as an adult, when I started to sit down and I started to realize that I was actually ignoring the last part of my calling. So I've talked about the call to adventure and my whole journey with that and how I had to access my potential and go through this whole alchemical process, and that I had to document it so that I could transmit it to others. Well, when it came to that point where I was supposed to start sharing that, that's when I realized that I was still carrying the bullying trauma, because it was really extremely difficult for me to access my creative energy and to speak up. And when I did speak up, I would oscillate from really expressing myself to going into like severe paralysis where I would just shut down for months at a time. I mean, at first it was like months at a time I would shut down. And I had all these coping mechanisms around it, but I really started to realize, oh shit, like this is holding me back. And I didn't realize I was still injured, psychologically injured from those experiences. So I went to work trying to unravel that from within. And that took on a lot of different layers and dimensions. It was like, you know, the mental criticism, self-criticisms and all that. I would have these mental storms that would come over and just throw me into really deep depressions. Of course, it showed up in the emotional body and the physical body. I actually had like stuck energy in my organs and stuff that I had to work with through physical cleansing. And one of the really cool aspects of that process, when I started to get into the more subtle layers of where that information was stored. So I started to sit down and meditate at a certain point, and I could bring my awareness into this layer of my field that was actually ingrained with the imprint of that experience. And so when I started to feel into that, I started to bring my consciousness into that subtle layer, right? That's where those kind of codes, light codes were, but it felt more like a film, like an overlay film. When I started to really lean into that in my meditations, that's when I started getting past life impressions. So I realized at that point that the reason it had taken me so long and so much energy and effort and so many layers of like moving through this stuff was because it went back further than just my childhood. It wasn't just me being bullied at school or being bullied by a parent. It was like, it was deeper than that, and it was further back than that. So, and I got that in sort of visceral impressions more than I did like literal memories so far. So right about that time, I was reading a book before bed one night, and I read the story of Hypatia, or some people pronounce it Hypatia, but I think it's pronounced Hypatia, of Alexandria. And when I read this story, it rippled through my entire being as these chills. And you know, when you get the chills when you hear something that's like so true or so touching, and it touched me like that. And I started bawling. And I'm about to start bawling right now. When I started crying, when I read that story, something clicked, and it was like this long thread from my own ancestry, not necessarily my biological ancestry, but my collective ancestry as a human. And it was pretty much like at that moment that everything I had been working on just clicked into place, and I started really, I think I started making these videos like pretty soon after that. So, so I went and looked up her story, and it really resonated with me. It was like I was like getting to know a friend or something. And it was like I was getting to know a part of myself almost. And you know, that whether or not I'm like energetically related to this person, or maybe I was her in a past life, whatever, you know, it's like somehow I felt that we were tapped into the same templates. Maybe that's what it is. So anyway, she was a fourth century Neoplatonist, I believe. I could be wrong about some of this stuff because I'm not a historian. Oh, but one thing I wanted to mention was like, history is not in the past. History is not in the past. And this is why it's so important for us not to destroy our history. History is with us right now. Everything that's happened to our ancestors, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the from the bodhisattvas to these murderous moments, right? They're infused. They're part of us. They're part of our collective mind. And we have to navigate through that material at times. And so it's really beneficial to at least have some historical stuff to look, historical information to look at too. Like we can heal through that. So, I'm really alarmed by the destruction of history. It's like, and a lot of these historical events get repeated in cycles, right? So that's not just, that's a metaphysical phenomenon too, because not only is human consciousness developed through those cycles, right? Through the reliving of these lessons, but it's a way for the unconscious mechanisms to cleanse, right? So we need to be aware of our history. We need to be aware of how those things cycle through. Anyway, so Hypatia was a 4th century Neoplatonist philosopher, astronomer, mathematician, in the footsteps of Plato and Pythagoras, and she taught at that university in Alexandria. I think it was a university at that time when like ancient Egypt and ancient Greece and Rome were all kind of converging. And you had everything from like Gnosticism, paganism, so many different traditions kind of melding in with Christianity. And you had all these scholars studying the nature of reality, like I said, through philosophy, through mathematics, through astronomy. And she was a truth seeker in this way during this time, as many scholars were at the time. And the story is that it was really unique because she was a woman, because, well, I guess women didn't really do that then. There wasn't many women that did. So this was a time when like Christian beliefs, like I said, were right alongside Gnostic and pagan traditions, and they didn't really conflict. There was a time in early Christianity when these didn't conflict, and she was alive during this time, and she taught all different kinds of people. She taught Christians and everyone, and she supposedly didn't attach herself to any one way or one tradition, but she made room for them all. And anyway, we could do another video about the ins and outs of like Gnosticism versus monotheism and all that, but we don't really need to go into that here. But anyways, there's this conflicting information about how she was killed, why she was murdered. And so the mainstream narrative for a long time, and they make movies and documentaries about her and everything, is that this Christian mob ordered by this Christian bishop, Cyril, murdered her for religious reasons, right? And so it's kind of like that's been the mainstream narrative. And then there's this narrative in feminism where the feminists kind of hold her as a martyr and say that she was murdered because she was a woman, right? And she was doing things women weren't necessarily supposed to do. And so some say it was religiously motivated and some say it was politically motivated. She did seem to have like a really great influence over certain political figures because she was highly intelligent and very wise. And so people sought her out for advice because she was wise and intelligent, and this was including prominent political figures at the time. And it does seem like it was at a time when religious zealotry was sort of interfacing with political motivations. So, like I said, these different modern factions kind of try to use her as a martyr. And I kind of want to steer clear of that. And one of the reasons I do is because, for example, take the feminists, for example. They might use her as a martyr because they're opposing the so-called patriarchy, right? But some of the worst modern mobs and mob mentality movements that I've seen recently come from the feminists or people that call themselves feminists. I call it late stage feminism. So I don't really go along with the narrative that I don't really want to take that narrative from her, from what happened to her, into that movement. Because to me, that mob mentality and that group think that can commit terrible acts is actually moving through the feminist movement now to some degree. It's moving through a few different movements. So that mentality, that group think, that mob mentality, that's a channeling of this unconscious shadow, trauma aspects, astral realms, entities, malevolent forces, that can change faces as time wears on. So just because it had a certain face, maybe it had a Christian face in that moment, but now it's got a feminist face sometimes. And you know what other face it has sometimes is these people who hate Christians now. So it's got almost like a Marxist face. So I just kind of wanted to like make the distinction that, you know, I don't really see it. I don't really see that it's that important, you know, who or why she was murdered. It was like she was murdered by a mob, whether it was politically motivated or religiously motivated. It was a form of groupthink, a form of possession, where those individuals did not have contact with their I am, and they murdered this woman violently. So I see her as a symbol, as that kind of evil that can move through any kind of movement if we're not careful, and that we need to actually be vigilant of how consciousness operates and not fall into that kind of consciousness, and recognize it and also know how to protect ourselves from it. So anyway, so I really resonate with this story of her, and I don't know how accurate it is, but I really resonate with her archetype that's told through her story, and mainly because her power and influence actually came from her intelligence and wisdom. And, you know, perhaps I hope that I can follow in those footsteps to some degree. Anyway, so she was violently murdered. This mob kind of dragged her out of her chariot, I think, and tore her clothes off in the middle of like everyone, and tore her flesh to shreds and dismembered her, and burned her body. And so, you know, part of the point too is like there's so many different stories like this in our ancestry, and there are so many different cycles of this kind of thing. And so I think it's important for us to understand, first of all, that we're in a cycle like that now. We're in the culmination of a cycle where phenomena like that, you know, they're already prevalent, but they could become even more prevalent. So it's important to watch out for that, understand that it's the manifestation of the shadow of humanity. That way we kind of know how to interact with it, understand our power as individuals to create these new pathways, to break templates and create new ones. In standing up to that, recognizing that it's a manifestation of shadow and interfacing with it from there. And so, yeah, so the positive side of these kinds of experiences and trauma templates is that we can rise up in our individual creative power and through our sovereign interconnection points and channel that source energy toward a higher enlightenment and higher thinking, and break these templates, rise up anew and forge a new path into a better world. So I think that's the end of my story. I'm going to watch it and see if I missed anything. I might redo it. I'm not sure, but you know, leave me a comment if you guys have any, if you want to discuss anything further, and Yeah, like and subscribe if you enjoy my content and my offerings. Come find me on my website, revolutionarybeing.com. Get on my email subscriber list. Find me on Facebook at Kaya Marie, KAYAMARIE. And yeah, I hope to see all of you soon. And I'm super grateful for having you all here and being able to have these open discussions about some of this stuff. All right, sending you guys love.